What's up? My name is Drew Paul Bell, and today what I want to talk about is Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how it affects you as an architect, as well as the products and the architecture that you produce as an architect. Okay, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs was asserted by Abraham Maslow, who was a famous psychologist of the 20th century. And his basic assertion in this idea is that every human being has particular needs that they have to have satisfied. And this is structured like a hierarchy because if you don't have the foundation level needs met, then you're not going to be able to focus on what's called higher consciousness needs. So this is structured like with physiological needs at the very bottom is the foundation. Then safety needs above that, love and belonging needs. Then you move into the higher consciousness level needs, esteem needs and self-actualization. So one of the basic understandings of this is, you have to have the bottom needs met. An example is, say you take somebody out of the desert, right, where they haven't eaten for like 30 days, and they don't have food in their body. They haven't met their needs for food and water. You put them at the table, and they're not going to be worried about table manners, right? Because those are higher consciousness needs. Those are esteem needs, love and belonging needs. They don't need anyone to accept them for who they are as a person, and they're worried about getting food in their body. Now, how does this affect what you produce as an architect, your buildings? Well, your buildings have to have running water. They have to have, the facilities to cook food or, meet those needs if someone's living there, right? You have to have these needs met. And something like running water might be really easy to meet in something like developed modern societies, but there are cultures and societies that are underdeveloped or have population crises, and getting running water to people is actually a lot harder than it could be in like in a more developed society. So these are things that should be taken for granted in your architecture. These are things that absolutely should be there, no questions asked. And in certain regions, certain situations, that's harder, but that's the kind of thing where we have to develop that to where that does happen. Because the basic idea, right, this being a hierarchy, if you have societies and groups of people who are struggling to get these needs met, then they're not going to be able to focus on living rewarding lives and getting to that higher consciousness level of existence, right? And it's not, when your day-to-day is worried about getting the food, you're sheltered, satisfied, and all that stuff, then you're not going to be able to focus on the things that really make life rewarding. So one thing though that I think that tends to get overlooked in these would be homeostasis. This is something that's actually really important for human beings, and one form of this comes from temperature. I swear I would see this like every August, the beginning of every fall semester. Living in Georgia is really hot in August, and everyone's walking around in shorts and t-shirts, but then they walk in the studio, for example, and they're blasting the AC like there's no tomorrow, and all of a sudden we're freezing cold. So in these times, right, or you even get situations where because of solar shading and heat gain, buildings are really hot. Like this is stuff that architecture can really control or influence. But if you get to the point where you're worried about AC, you're freezing, or you're burning up and you're too hot, as a student, you're not going to be able to focus on the higher level consciousness needs of problem solving and creativity and being a great architect when you're freezing cold in studio because they're blasting the air conditioning and the thermostat adjusters don't actually do anything. Same thing for your clients, for people who live in your buildings. If they're living in a building that is so hot that they can't focus, they're not going to be able to meet their needs of creativity or even their security needs of keeping a job. How are they going to be able to focus on doing the tasks that are in front of them that they have to do? So physiological needs These are the foundational building blocks of everything else. If you can't get these satisfied, you're not going to be able to focus on the more important, well, not more important, but the higher level consciousness things of your existence. It's kind of what makes life the most fun. So, physiological needs. Next is safety needs. Safety needs translates pretty easily to the understanding of structure. Like if your building doesn't stand up, it's going to fall down, then you didn't meet safety needs. All right, but that's, again, this is the level where things ought to be taken for granted, right? The potential of a building falling down shouldn't even be part of the equation. All right, that's something that that should be taken for granted. It should definitely stand up, right? No questions asked. But where you begin to get into the kind of the gray area of this is things like safety, where when you consider how your building impacts the safety of like the street or public life. Say you don't put windows on the ground floor of on a streetscape. All of a sudden you don't have any eyes on the street. If you don't have people watching people on the street, then you've created an environment at that street edge where crime is now more likely to happen because people in that environment don't feel like they're being watched. Right? This idea of eyes on the street is critical in any kind of urban design setting, and this plays into the safety needs of architects, of the buildings that we produce. The safety needs in terms of you as maybe a student in an architecture studio. That comes down to how safe do you feel in terms of your resources not being stolen. Right? Maybe you need to get a lockbox to get your stuff under control, but if you feel like there are people running around who are stealing things, then that's going to be a problem. If you're too worried about that, your safety from that perspective, then again, you're not going to be able to focus on the problem solving and creativity of designing beautiful buildings. Love and belonging. This is something that's hard to tackle as an architect, but it's critically important in what separates architecture from buildings, right? The buildings that you produce, the houses, right, the offices, they have to provide the spaces for interaction, right? We as human beings are naturally social beings. We need friendship, we need family, we need a level of intimacy with people. Without that, our confidence crumbles. And this is kind of in the middle of this hierarchy of needs. It's still on, this is still kind of the zone that's considered lower consciousness, like you need this. Like if you don't have this met, then you're coming from a deficiency spot, right? Love and belonging needs, as well as safety and physiological needs. So this translates to architecture in the built environment in ways like social spaces, living rooms, and like the hearth, right? The idea of a space where a family can gather and find that sense of community, or like community centers in larger urban scale projects or public spaces. And then this also translates to intimacy, right, to private spaces. How are you going to have rooms that are separate and allow individuality in terms of people, allow them to have intimate moments with each other as well as privacy from other people. These love and belonging needs are really important for what you build and architecture and the way that it functions. This comes down to like really the social aspects of architecture. In terms of you in studio, I think you see these issues come up a lot where you might see students who are focused more on building friendships, sometimes at the expense of studio. Now again, this is considered lower level consciousness. Like this is a need that if you don't have it satisfied, then you're not going to be able to focus on the then you're operating from a place of deficiency, right? But so this is something that needs to be met, but I think sometimes you see people overindulge in this level at the expense of the higher levels. And friendship, family, sexual intimacy, these are all things that are very important, but if you have to be careful not to get kind of too caught up in this and let the rest of your esteem needs, your accomplishment needs, if you let those fall by the wayside because you're too busy socializing with your friends and you're not working on the studio, or you go into studio and you socialize all the times, but you don't ever get your work done, right? This can become a problem. But you have to strike that balance, right? You also can't work all the time and not have any sort of social outlet, because then you're going to struggle to really create creative and exciting designs. Okay, so that's love and belonging needs. Now, the esteem needs. Now, this is beginning to move into the realm of the higher consciousness, higher kind of peak experience part of the hierarchy of needs. This is the part where you're not any longer operating from a form of deficiency if you don't have this. This is kind of like the realm where you're playing to win instead of playing to not lose. You don't need to have confidence or esteem. You can survive just fine. You can walk around on Earth for 80, 90 years without esteem needs or being self-actualized. But this is still important in the whole concept of the human condition, right? Of being human, meeting these needs. This is what fulfills us. This is what makes us happier instead of making us less sad. This is playing to win instead of playing to not lose. So in your esteem needs, these are needs that are met by reaching some sort of achievement for your clients, right? For people who hire architects, for what you're going to do as a designer. What you build is several times is going to mark achievement for your clients, right? Some people build human beings have been building monuments for as long as we have records, you know. The buildings that you produce, in their good design, in their uniqueness, in their quality and beauty, can convey a sense of self, right? A sense of confidence for your client. It can represent a certain identity. You look at like urban design and urban identities of cities like Charleston, South Carolina, having such a clean, such clearly defined aesthetic. It builds to the self-esteem. It builds to an identity in the same way that like branding or imagery happens with marketing and businesses. This kind of esteem needs, they can be met by architecture from a design aesthetic, from being attractive, right? So this meets that esteem needs and also the achievement. From a student's perspective, from an architect's perspective, you meet these by focusing on your work, on producing stuff and finding achievement, gaining the respect of others because of the work that you put in, because your devotion to your craft. You know, you eventually have to grow to the point where you have the confidence to build a building, right? Because think about how nervous, you know, maybe like if you're first new, like freshman in school, maybe you feel like you don't know anything, maybe you hesitate to even raise your hand and speak up in class. If you struggle, if you can never overcome those insecurities, that lack of self-esteem, that lack of confidence, then you're going to definitely struggle with asserting a building into the world and saying that, hey, I've made this is beautiful. It takes a lot of self-confidence, it takes a lot of self-esteem to produce anything and kind of give it to the world. You have to work on cultivating this confidence, building self-esteem in school to where you have what it takes, the fortitude to create things, but at the same time having the respect of others and respecting others' opinions, so that you're not just being a dickhead and throwing your work out in the world and being like, fuck you guys if you don't like it, but you also have to understand, like, respect others, right? And with that comes a certain amount of peace, right? This is going back again to this higher level of consciousness and kind of higher sense of being in just the way that you experience the world, right? It comes with a certain kind of ease to it. All right, so anyway, that's esteem needs. Now, self-actualization. This is dealing with morality, creativity, problem solving, acceptance of facts, lack of prejudice. This is where you kind of deal with like the greatness of being human, right? This is like the highest level of consciousness. Self-actualization is actually something that not everybody achieves. As an architect, as a designer, as a student, as somebody operating in studio, I think architecture and this creative field is very closely linked to this level of the pyramid, right? To this hierarchy. You're in this zone where what we do is necessarily creative. It deals with issues of morality, in terms of like lack of prejudice in the hierarchies of your spaces, of who gets access to certain views, or the way that spaces are structured. That it can really deal with this if it tries to, if it tackles that. And the way that you produce things, the way that you give your art to the world, right? That requires a certain connection to this self-actualized level, this kind of peak experience, that flow state. These peak experiences, it's really like the joyous moment where you lose track of time and you love what you're doing. And this, to me, is what it totally symbolizes: playing to win and not playing to not lose. It's that moment where you're working with your design and you're working out the plan and it just doesn't work, and finally you start figuring it out and it starts to work itself out. And that moment when it finally all starts coming together. And those moments are so exciting, right? The moments where you're figuring out how the structure is going to work, or how you're going to pipe in the water to the building, isn't the most like fun and rewarding moments. They're necessary, you have to do them, but it's probably not what gets you out of bed in the morning. But that moment where you're working everything out and it's finally coming together, that's the self-actualization level. That is probably what gets you out of bed in the morning. I know it is for me, right? So there's those moments that you need to be able to get to in order to really scratch that. You don't need to be able to get there, but it's those moments that make it worth it all. There's the stereotype of the architect who designs buildings that look great and they're beautiful and airy-fairy, but they don't function, right? They let water leak in, or their structure is kind of iffy, and then you have people who see that and then they react to it, and then they're on the other side and then they say, we're going to build this building and it's going to keep the water out and it's going to structurally work, it's going to get the job done, but they're going to do it really cheap and it's going to be ugly and it's going to be completely generic and look like everything else, and it could be completely uninspired in their design. And you have stereotypically you have these two different sides, where one is worried about only the form and not the function, and then the other one that's worried about only the function in terms of the physiological and safety needs, but is not concerned about the self-actualization and the esteem needs, and it lacks on the beauty. And I would argue that real architecture manages to deal with both of those. It can manage the physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization needs of the clients, of occupants, of people. And this is a discussion that, again, is about something that is difficult, right? How do you really balance all these things? How do you help people live a more self-actualized life with designs, right? That's a hard question to answer. But again, I'm arguing that if you're not trying to answer that question, then what are you doing? So I hope this all helps. I highly recommend that you take a lot of time to really sit down with this hierarchy. It's something that I think is pretty easy, I think, for a lot of people to kind of digest and understand. I struggle to put it into words, but I think that a lot of people know it naturally because they've known this. They look at it and they realize that, like, when they're hungry, they're not going to be able to be polite necessarily, or be worried about some creative thing. Sometimes they have to have that stuff handled, right? But so to spend some time with this hierarchy, understand its implications on what you build, you as an architect, and also understand how you are impacted by it as a human being, as someone who is trying to produce work, someone who is trying to do great things and achieve like the self-actualization levels and esteem levels of this hierarchy. How are these going to affect you, right? So, like, make sure you don't skip meals, or make sure that, like, you still have like a social outlet. You can't just work 100% of the time and all this stuff. But so anyway, I hope this all helps, and I'll talk to you next time.